let me welcome Eric Berg. Hi, Eric. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing good.
Yes, enjoying the nice weather in Germany also?
Yeah, absolutely. So it was quite a sunny day today. The snow is still melting.
Oh, you still have some snow.
Yeah, we had 50 centimeters snow overnight last week. So there was still a bunch. But yeah, now we're getting back to normal. I think we're 15 degrees today. So all good.
Yeah, true. So, Eric, I believe that your presentation is going to be a very nice add-on to the previous one. You're going to talk about combining Azure Policy and Azure DevOps.
Yeah. I think there will be some things that might be in common. And then I think it's a good addition to the overall lineup because everybody cares anyhow about policies, and everybody's looking into DevOps or GitHub or whatever. So yeah, hope that there's some value into it.
Sure. So you can start sharing your presentation.
Okay.
And you can see about going live. Okay. That's visible.
Okay. And we still have 9 minutes left, I think.
Yes, correct. Let's give some time for people to take a bio break, grab some coffee.
Yeah. Get the first nice comment.
It's been a long day for us, at least in the organization.
I can imagine. Earlier this day, I was already at the Azure Saturday in Hamburg, here in Germany.
Oh,
it was also quite interesting. So now switched countries. So that's the nice thing about those virtual conferences, I think.
yeah, in a way. But to be honest, I missed that traveling part. I visited Azure Saturday in Berlin 2 years ago, I believe, in 2019, and it was a great conference over there. So it was fun and very nice meeting other people from the industry, talking about all different stuff. And yeah, even asking questions and that communication with a speaker as you are, it's much easier in those live sessions. So.
Yeah, that's right. So you can transfer the knowledge. So that's the thing. But the chat with the coffee in your hand afterwards, like, hey, how did you mean that? And have you ever seen this? And have you tried that? So that's normally what's the big value in those in-person events.
Yeah.
Because let's say the interesting part comes right after the session.
Yeah, but people sometimes don't like to ask questions during the sessions. But yeah, as you said, afterwards with a coffee or in the evening when we gather around beer and something, that's the time when we actually share a lot of knowledge and experience.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's one thing that we're missing. But hopefully by the end of this year, those things will get back.
I hope so. But for now, let's hope that everybody's safe and healthy.
True.
That's the most important thing right now.
True. So looking at the time, we were already starting some of the sessions a couple of minutes before the actual hour. So if you're ready, people are constantly online, they don't need to switch the rooms or something. So we can start. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So now let's hope on my PowerPoint skills, because that's normally the situation where it starts lagging. Okay, let's get this thing started. Hello, everyone. Nice to see you over there. I'm right now based in Germany, in the wonderful city of Weimar. I think a city nobody has ever heard of. Everybody knows Berlin and Munich and Cologne and whatever. And in the end, I'm right in the middle of everything. So most people know Weimar maybe from the Weimar Republic or because of Goethe and Schiller. So that's the things we're famous for. But today, let's get into some security related and some management related stuff. So I want to talk a little bit about Azure Policy and Azure DevOps. And I want to ask the question, and I hopefully can share an answer with you about, is it good to have it together, or should we decouple it, or how does it fit together in the end? Yeah, let's have a look. Then we find out this during this session. Maybe one or two words about myself up front. So as I mentioned already, my name is Eric, based in Germany. I'm a so-called director consulting expert at a company called CGI. CGI is also called the best hidden secret in market. While we are an 80,000 people company, most people never have heard of us because we're just in enterprise scale and direct connections. So we don't do any marketing or sales or whatever. But yeah, I have a job there and I have a lot of work, so cannot complain. When I'm not working, I'm doing a lot of community stuff. I have a blog, a podcast. I'm running the Azure meetup here in my area, for example. And therefore, since 2015, I'm a Microsoft MVP, and right now I'm an MVP for Azure and Cloud and Data Center Management. In the rest of my spare time, I also do quite a bunch of LinkedIn learning trainings, unfortunately just in German language, but hey, maybe we can practice together. Then maybe also those trainings could be interesting. Overall, I'm interested in cloud, data center, and management topics. So I have grown up in this area. I have a very hard print of Microsoft on me. So I'm a Microsoft fanboy up to a certain level, which does not mean that I'm not looking into other technologies or other platforms. So I'm also working with Google Cloud Platform or Amazon Web Services and so on. But yeah, my heart is with Microsoft, I have to be honest. If you have any questions, feel free to type them in chat, post them to me via Twitter, email, whatever. And if you wake up in the middle of the night and you remember like, I wanted to ask this question, but I forgot it, no worries. You can reach me, leave a comment on the website or whatever you want. So, and what are we looking in today? We will have a quick recap of the topic around Azure governance, because when we are talking about policy and working with policies, then this all falls into the governance space. And the second thing, we will have an overview about the Azure policy situation itself. What are policies, how are they working, and how does it look like in the Azure portal these days? Then we try to bridge the gap over to DevOps and find out what we can do with Azure DevOps over there. And then we try to combine those things. We will have a look into certain scenarios. One thing that's quite interesting is the template validation in the pipeline, and I will explain to you why this is so important. We will have a look into pre- and post-deployment tasks related to Azure policies. We will have a look into how can we manage policy as code, and if we are managing policy as code, how we could deploy such a policy via Azure DevOps. So that's what we are around here. And we have quite a bunch of live demos included. But let's start with some slides. When we have a look into the overall Azure services landscape map, then we see there are a whole bunch of services. And as we all know, there are quite a bunch of Azure data centers or Azure regions out there, wherein every region has a multiple set of data centers. And on top of this, we find all those infrastructure services around compute, storage, and network. So far, nothing special. And when we have a look the level above into the platform services, then we will find all the stuff that makes the cloud very interesting because it's more managed. There are some things that we've never seen before in the on-premises world. And there's one thing also which Microsoft counts to the platform services, and that's Azure DevOps. So one piece of our session today already found. The second thing that we will find above the infrastructure layer is everything around management and security. Because if you want to run all those services, you have to have in place quite an amount of management tasks. You have to monitor, you have to control, you have to back up, you have to have an idea about disaster recovery scenarios, you have to check your costs, etc. And also from the security portion, you need a secure login, a way to store all your secrets, as we've seen in the session before. So what we want to do today is to bridge the gap between the management piece of Azure Policy and the DevOps platform service, Azure DevOps. So how do those two things work together? Because now it depends on how deep you've had a look into Azure DevOps. Many people think about DevOps mostly in a way when it comes to application development, like, hey, there is my guy who builds the code for our enterprise application, and then he's using such a DevOps pipeline to deploy it to our platform. What has it to do with my Azure policies? Maybe you have seen it in work together with infrastructure as code, like, hey, I deploy my infrastructure in Azure, my whole, I don't know, networks, VMs, web apps, everything that you have out there with infrastructure as code, and then maybe you have a look into Azure DevOps. So how does this all fit now together with Azure Policy? But before we dive into this, let's have a quick recap of the governance. So when we are dealing with cloud, there are some, let's say, certain problems. The main problem is cloud costs money. That's sometimes a surprise for many customers, but hey, that's it, how it is. And Azure governance is actually describing how to solve or how to prevent those problems. Because the governance, by definition, is the establishment of policies. Oh, here it's getting interesting because we are talking about policies today. The continuous monitoring of those policies and to make sure that they are properly implemented. So what does it mean? Let's say you need the game rules before you can start a game. And the easiest thing to explain it is, if you're starting with Azure, there's a thing, I tried to make it a meme or whatever, called click, click, cloud. So every time you talk to a cloud vendor, and it's the same with Microsoft, Google, Amazon, whomever in the world, they will come to you and say, hey, we have this super fancy portal. Go into the super fancy portal, click on 1, click on 2, click on 3, here you go, you have cloud now. And yes, on the one hand side, that's right. That's working, but that's not the way how you should do it, because click, click, cloud doesn't bring in any security, any monitoring, any backup, any whatever, because click, click, cloud will just create you, for example, a VM. And just to share you some war stories out of my personal experience, I once had a client who spent, I think it was 4,500 euros a month for quite a year without noticing. How does it happen? They had visit from one of the cloud vendors doing a proof of concept. Like, hey, have a look. We have this super fancy thing. Let's click, 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 click. They've created 3 Azure Cosmos DBs and tested it. And it was nice and it was interesting. And then everybody left. The customer left. The consultant left. Everybody was gone. But the Azure resources were still running and nobody had to look into it. And hey, here we go. It was super expensive. So they spent a whole bunch of money for kind of a year on services they've never used. That's maybe the easy piece because it's just like, hey, you spent some money that you didn't want to spend. Okay, lessons learned. But let's think one step further. You want to establish your HR database in the cloud, and by accident, someone is publishing this to Brazil. Or I've seen this in a client of mine I'm working currently with. It's a bank, and you can imagine German banks have very, very heavy rules when it comes to operating an IT infrastructure. And by accident, somebody has created a resource in East Asia. Because if you're going into the Azure Portal and you just click through the assistance, Asia is mostly the first selected item if you have a new login into the portal. So those things can happen. And now it's too good to have an establishment of policies, like saying, hey, we have a written paper where everybody states, no, we don't want this. But a written paper has never prevented something. So we really have to implement this technically, and we have to continuously monitor if everybody sticks to the rules. And that's what comes in when we're talking about cloud governance. And besides the idea behind governance, saying like, I have policies, I know them, they are implemented, and I will continuously monitor them, there's also a technical part into governance. And in Microsoft Azure, most of the governance runs through the Azure Resource Manager. Because as you know, hopefully know, everything you do to your Azure portal or to your Azure resources is handled by the Azure Resource Manager. So no matter if you're using the Azure Portal, the Azure CLI, the PowerShell, the I don't know what, any third-party SDK, In the end, it's management.azure.com, which is the REST API that will handle all your requests. It's just translated into a command line interface or whatever, or even presented by a portal to make it a bit easier. So in the end, Azure Resource Manager is handling everything. Let's say that's the transmission unit between the outside and the inside. And now we have certain tools to deal with it. One of the big tools inside of the Azure Resource Manager is the so-called policy engine, which actually is the thing we want to have a look at today, because this policy engine helps us to evaluate if certain things are actually allowed or against the rules or with the rules, or however, is it okay to do this? So, and as you can see, the policy engine sits in the center of everything. On the below, you see all the resource providers like virtual machines, storage networks, and whatever. And then to the left, you have some configuration methods like the blueprints. On the right, you have the resource graph, where you can query a huge amount of resources from the cloud without waiting an active query, because you're looking into index data. But as you can see, yeah, it's all around this. And there's quite a lot more, like role-based access control, and there's the subscription management and the cost management and so on. So this brings us into the idea of, hey, well, now we have this policy engine, but what is it doing? In the end, the whole policy thing is the allow or define system inside of Azure. And when we have a look into how Azure works, we all know this funny, nice portal. And we will have a look into this in a quick second. And in the portal, everybody has heard about the identity and access management. So I can reduce the rights that you have. For example, I can say, hey, you're only allowed to create VMs. What I can't do is to limit your scope with an identity and access management rule, because I can say, hey, here's your subscription or your resource group or whatever, and I give you the right to create VMs. But I cannot say you're only allowed to create 5 VMs. I cannot say you're only allowed to create VMs in this region or from this size. Not with the identity and access management. But I can do this with policies. And that's actually the thing that we're looking in. So the allow and define system works in an if-then condition. So if you want to do this, then this happens or does not happen or whatever. And there are some certain actions that can happen. So there are some things that we can append, like, hey, if you want to create a resource, I will add something to your deployment. For example, I will add, I don't know, some tag configurations or whatever. I will audit this, so I will log it down. So I don't prevent you from doing this, but I will actually make a notice of it so that we can track it afterwards. I also can have a look if something is not existent, like, hey, every machine requires a backup. I can have a look if your deployment actually has a backup. And if it's not in the backup, I can decide what to do with it. I can actually deny things, and I think this is where policies mostly kick in for many, many people, like saying, hey, if you want to deploy this database into Brazil, no, I will deny it. I won't allow it. We can also deploy things if they are not existing. Coming back to the backup thing. So if your VM has no backup configured, I could deploy it. If there should be a monitoring agent on your VM and you don't have installed it, I could deploy it. We could disable a rule, a policy, okay, that's easy. And there's a thing how we can modify certain things via the resource policies. So let's have a look how this looks like in the portal. So when you go into the portal, the easiest way to open Azure Policy View is just to type in policy in here, and you will find the service policy over there. And then all starts in the overview tab. And in the overview tab, you will see some information about resource compliance states and the overall resource compliance and things like this. The interesting thing is that by default, you might have some policies assigned that you've never touched on your own end. Because when you use Azure Security Center, no matter in which licensing model, Azure Security Center by default activates some policies to enable monitoring, logging, and stuff like this. So that's, let's say, the default view. Then you can dive a little bit more into detail in the compliance view, where you can really have a look, okay, now here's my policy. So what is actually in there and why isn't it compliant and which resources are not compliant? So it really goes down onto a single policy, a single set that should be there, and then it's telling you that it's not compliant. And when we have a look, for example, here onto the enable logging, then I can see way more detail about, okay, what is it about? What are the policies in there? And then I can also see the resource compliance. So which resources are actually compliant and which are not. There's also a remediation tab. So in the remediation tab, we can see if or what is actually possible to remediate via policies. For example, you can see here, there's a deploy threat detection on SQL servers. So this is also coming from the Azure Security Center data protection piece. So if you have enabled this for your SQL servers, automatically the threat detection solution will be deployed to your SQL servers if you enable it. And then there are some tasks that could be added too. The main thing for Azure Policies is the definitions and assignments piece. And if we have a look in here into the definitions, which is kind of the definition, the creation of a policy, we have a whole bunch of policies in there. And then it's important to know that there are two different policy definitions. One thing is the policy itself, which is one rule to be executed. And then if you need a grouping of rules, then it's called an initiative, where you can pull multiple rules together into a big set. Because, for example, if you have a look in here into the initiative for NIST compliance, there are 790 policies in there. And trust me, you don't want to assign 790 policies one by one to other resources. But also if you say, hey, I need it just for my own sake, for example, you could go and create an own initiative. For example, here I've created audit rules with just 2 policies. So it's a little bit easier to manage it. And there we also see, besides the built-in policies, we find custom policies. And I will go into this in a quick second. Let's have a look for one of the commonly used policies out there. One policy everybody might have heard of about already is the allowed locations policy. And if we have a look in there, we pretty fast understand how policies are actually built and working. We always get an overview, a little bit of description. What is this policy actually doing? What is the input that is required? So which parameters are delivered with the policy? And in this situation here, we have the array of allowed locations. So we have to bring a list of locations that are fine for us. And then we have the policy rule itself with a classical if-then condition. And it actually states if the field is not in the list, or the location, sorry, the location is not in the list, the location is not global, and the type is not a B2C directory, then I will deny your action. So I won't allow you to change something, to deploy something, to whatever you want to do. So why do we have those two things in here? There are some resources out there which are not tied to a certain region. They're just called global. And B2C directories are specific type, which is also not fitting into this allowed location situation. So this is why they are excluded here by default. And then the effect is just deny, as mentioned. So looking back in here, and we just removed the location piece. Whoops, we removed the location piece. We just have a look into our custom policies. There you can see I've created my own policies here. And when I have a look into the PIP, so public IP restrictions, I very often use public IPs to demonstrate things because they're super fast when you create them. So you don't have to wait 5 minutes until a VM is booted up or whatever. So PIPs are quite nice to test things. And this is a custom created policy, but it still follows the same thing. You can see it still has a property of a name, policy name, so category. I didn't put in this description here. I don't have any parameters because it's a hard-coded policy. And then we once again follow the if-then situation. So I say, if you want to create something of the type public IP address in the location North Europe, then I won't allow this. So, okay, so actually I'm saying public IPs in North Europe are not fine. For whatever reason, just for demoing purposes. So, and with this policy definition so far, I've not achieved anything because this is just a definition. It's just like written on paper. Now we actually have to implement it. And therefore, we have those assignments. And now there are multiple ways to handle this. I could go in here and say, assign a policy. I could also do it from here, from inside my policy, and say, assign. This all will bring us into the same direction. So no matter where we go. And now you have to choose your scope. And actually, that's quite interesting what you choose here, because when we have a look into our scope, you start on the management group level. You can then go down into a subscription level, and then you could even go down into a resource group level. And as you can see right here, I have not the full list of my subscriptions. I actually have 3 or 4 subscriptions in there, but only one is actually choosable. And when I have a look into this policy here, which is actually quite the same thing, and I say assign, and I have a look in here, I will get a whole bunch of other subscriptions. So why is that? Every policy I create has a location where it is stored. So as you can see, the upper public IP policy is stored in my tenant root group. So it's in the master management group, the highest level that you will ever find. And the other ISP, the other restriction policy is hosted in the mountain master group. And in this management group, only one subscription, my MSDN subscription, is in there. All the others are lying around on the tenant root group. So actually storing your location, your storage location for your policy defines where you could apply it. And if you go a bit further, like here, I actually stored it inside of my subscription level. So I will only be able to apply it to this subscription or any resource group in there. So let's do this now. So we can have a look in here. We see our public IP address for North Europe with the action deny. And I will assign this one, and I will assign it to my sponsorship subscription. And there is a resource group called Azure Saturday Belgrade. It's in German. So let's select this one. I don't want to exclude anything. Let's call it public IP restrict, and I will review it and will create it. So now actually we have taken the paper and put it into place so that it's really applied to the resources that we have. And now there are multiple ways to check if your policy is actually working. First thing, you should have a look if it's showing up here in the assignments. So that's actually working quite well. When we have a look now here into our resource group, and go on create and just say public IP. And there's a public IP address. We want to create this. IPv4 standard, that's all fine. Call it test public IP. And we are choosing West Europe, North Europe. North Europe is the one that's actually not allowed. So let's click on create. And now you have seen for a quick second down there, there was a text stating validate. And that's the moment where the policy engine is going through the deployment and saying like, okay, I have to do this, 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 this. And here are my policies. And I will check if all those steps are fine. And at this point, we got a policy validation error or a validation error at all. And actually in the details, we can see test PIP was disallowed by the policy, and the policy is called restrict public IP. So that's quite nice. Actually, we now prevent us from creating public IPs in North Europe. Okay, so far so good. What happens in the background? Coming back to the presentation. On the left, that's me. I'm the user. I have some code. And as I mentioned, no matter if we are using the portal or if we're using PowerShell or CLI or whatever, in the end, it's always code going to the Azure Resource Manager. So I have my resource config request. I push it into the system, and it's going into the Azure Policy Engine. And now 4 things happen after each other. 1, we go through all those policies that are disabled. Okay, forget it. We go through all the policies that have an append or modify point in it. Why? Because if we append or modify something, we could affect the following policies because we change the deployment, and maybe we're coming into a situation where we have to deny or audit something. So that's the reason why we first do the things that change the deployment itself. Then we have a look in, hey, what is denied? Because what is denied must not be audited. And last but not least, we have a look into everything that has to be audited. And then if that's all okay, and it's not denied, we go into a situation where the cloud resource, oh my God, where the cloud resource has been created. After this, the last two steps are taken. We have a look into everything that has to be deployed if it's not existing, and then we audit everything that is not existing, which is also not being deployed. So you can see every time you click on the tiny little button, create, and this tiny little validate pops up, there's quite a lot of things happening in the background. So that's actually the policy engine doing its work. Okay, so that's the policy side of life. Quite nice so far. Now let's have a look into the DevOps side before we bring those two things together. When we talk about Azure DevOps, actually Azure DevOps is not really a thing, because in real, Azure DevOps consists out of certain modules. So we have Azure Boards, Azure Repos, Azure Pipelines, Azure Artifacts, and Azure Test Plans. And those are the things that do the magic. Azure DevOps is just the wrapper around it, which is the interesting name for everyone to take. The interesting thing is also Azure DevOps is just the tooling, coming from the DevOps perspective. That's just the tooling. DevOps needs a whole lot of process and people change management. So just because you're using Azure DevOps, you're not practicing DevOps. Just saying that. Okay, so with Azure DevOps, we have some interesting things. So with the boards, we could track all our work items and all the tasks that we have. We have a Kanban board, for example, where we can move all our areas and items. We have the repositories, Git repositories, where we could store some code, which might get interesting in the next few minutes. We have some pipelines, which are actually able to execute things for us, also interesting for the future. We have the Azure Artifact Store, where you can get some external packages in. And then there's a feature for test plans, which might not be that interesting for today. Just a quick look into the pricing situation. Azure DevOps is possible to be used for free for the first 5 users. So if you're opening up an Azure DevOps project, an organization, you will have 5 users free, and you always have a free usage in there. And then it kind of depends on what are you doing. Is it an open source project? You can see you get quite a bunch of parallel jobs and Microsoft hosted agent time. You can use the Azure Boards feature for free. You can use Azure Repos, unlimited scope. You can use 2 gigabytes of Azure Artifact Store. It's all fine. And from the 6th user on, you will pay around about €5 per month. So that's quite okay. If you're not on the open source side and you want to have a closed source, then it's the basic plan. You see it's a little bit more limited on the Azure Pipelines side, but the rest is pretty much the same, and then also the pricing is the same. And then there's a test plans subscription where you add the test plans on top of it, and then it's getting quite expensive with more than €40 a month. But then you have heavy testing capabilities, automated testing, manual testing, test plans, test feedback runs, and so on and so on. And if you have a look into real testing suites, then €40 is not too much, but compared to the €5, actually it is. There's one important thing that you should keep in mind when dealing with DevOps. There are DevOps organizations and DevOps projects. So what's the main difference? You can have an organization in DevOps, so called, for example, Contoso Manufacturing, Contoso Supply Chain, whatever. And inside of this organization, you can have multiple projects. The limits that you've seen, and also the number of free users you've seen, are bound to your organization. So every time you create a new organization, you will get into this pricing situation. So plan carefully how many organizations you will start. Because if you, in the end, have 5 organizations, but all your 20 developers need all those 5 organizations, then you will pay 5 times the licenses. So be a bit careful with that. What you could do, you could easily have in one organization multiple projects with the same team members. So you will separate the code, the repositories, the pipelines. You can have separated access rights. So everything is fine and separated there, but it's in the same organization and so in the same licensing frame. It's just the tiny little advice I want to give today. Okay, now let's bring those things together. So one thing that we could do, easy thing, we can have a look here in my Visual Studio. I have 2 easy peasy ARM templates. The one is creating a public IP address in North Europe. The other one is creating a public IP address in West Europe. As you can see, The only difference here is the location between those. I now could go ahead and deploy those things manually. Hey, but why should I? I have Azure DevOps pipeline, so let's use them. And in here, I have an easy pipeline, which is actually looking into my repository. And in this repository, I have an easy deploy step. So I will take my deployment, put it into the resource group for West Europe, and then take my West Europe public IP deployment. And I can have a look into the North Europe thing. It's doing pretty much the same, just with the location for North Europe and the North Europe template. So that's it. Let's create a release and let's push this through. So release 3 has been created. So why am I showing you a deployment where we actually know that it won't work, because we just have together created the policy that will deny at least the North Europe thing. The interesting thing is about this, Azure DevOps and the pipeline in here is just doing what you're asking for. So it's actually saying, hey, you want me to create those things. As you can see, it's going into the first step, then it's going into the second step, and it's just doing its work. And as you can see, it has failed. So let's see what happens. So it initialized the job, downloaded the artifact, so pulled the JSON file from the Git, and then it actually went into the ARM deployment and said like, hey, my deployment failed because it was disallowed by policy. So why is this so interesting? Now, this is a super easy ARM template. That's a one gamer, just one resource in an ARM template. How often in your life will you deploy an ARM template with just one resource? Maybe not that often. So the thing is, if you have 50 resources in there, it might happen that a template starts to be deployed. The first 2 or 3 resources are actually already deployed, and then your deployment fails because the 6th resource is actually against the policies. That's a crappy situation, because now we have a half complete deployment. So there are 6 resources already existing and 4 resources not finished because you run into a policy validation situation. So the easiest way, what you could do, you could go and test your deployments, because there's a wonderful, nice feature in the PowerShell, or you can go even with another tool, which is called Test AZ Resource Group Deployment. So what I'm doing here is I just take my template file and test the deployment, and I just evaluate the output. So I have a look, and I will see, okay, validation successful. Oh, template not conform to policy. So we have an issue because my template is actually not valid to be deployed to this environment. Let's test this on the other side with the Western Europe, which should not be forbidden right now. Run selection for this. And here we go, we see validation successful. So all fine with that. Now, okay, we could do this with PowerShell on our own every time we want to change something in a JSON file. But hey, we could also integrate this into our pipeline number 2, where we just add a tiny little step in here before we go into the deploy step, which is quite the same as before. We add a PowerShell script, and we go that far that we use an Azure Powershell script, which is actually already authenticated, so you don't have to mess around with the keys and credentials and whatever. And we actually run exactly this code with an easy thing to say, if there is an error action, please stop it. And as we are writing here an error in the situation where the template is not conform to the policy, this pipeline will stop and will not start deploying this. And so even the 6 resources that might get deployed before we run into the policy issue are not created because we've stopped this template or this deployment earlier. So let's do the same thing here. Let's have a look into this side. So our North Europe was not created. Our West Europe was created. Quite nice. We can have a look into our resource group and check if that actually worked. Here we go, and our public IP address is created. So pipeline 2 is running, and we see we are starting with North Europe again, but this time, let me have a look into the thing. We are stopped at the test deployment stage already, because here we have, oh, okay, it was quite a bit different. It was a scripting error. But it actually would have stopped at the test deployment if I not have taken the copy and paste issue from another repo. In the end, that's what it should do, not executing the ARM template. So that's the thing about the demo gods, as always. Okay, so easily in your deployment pipeline, you could integrate oops, that was not the thing I wanted to do. You could easily integrate such things like test AZ resource group deployment. And if you're not running with ARM templates, JSON files, you could do exactly the same also for Terraform, for whatever. So they all have a testing situation, and then you will run against your policies in the matter of. Okay, so validate templates, a thing we can actually do in combination with Azure DevOps, quite easy. Second thing, pre and post deployment tasks. Let's imagine a bit further. So one thing is, I don't want you to deploy a database into Brazil. That's fine. I don't want you to create a public IP in North Europe. That's fine. But do you really want to deploy an application into an environment that is unsafe? So coming back to our policy view from a little bit earlier, if I have a look into such a situation and I see that I have a compliance state of 17% and I have 77 non-compliant resources, is it a good idea to deploy my critical application into this environment? Good question, I'd say. So actually, maybe not. And there's one nice thing in Azure DevOps, which actually allows us to check the policy state or the compliance state of a deployment before we go into it. So as you can see, I've changed the layout a little bit. I said, hey, let's deploy to West Europe, and then later let's deploy to North Europe. And there is an option. If you go onto those tiny little tabs here, there is an option for gates. And you can have them post or pre, so before or after your current deployment step. And there's one thing called the check policy compliance. And if we have a look into check policy compliance, we should have not taken the copy and paste from another repo. Azure Saturday Belgrade, here we go. And we're just saying, hey, before you go into this deployment step, please check the policy compliance in this subscription and in this resource group. And that's all. So what will happen is only if the compliance state is good, only if the compliance state is healthy, the deployment will actually start running. So my HR database, my high critical data will only be pushed into a compliant environment and will not be pushed anywhere else. And the same thing I can do is I can do this afterwards in my post-deployment steps. There's also the option to go into gates, check policy compliance. Here we go, ready to move on. So because before I want to deploy the next resource, maybe now load my application to the infrastructure I've deployed, I once again want to check if my last deployment not broke any of the compliance rules. So that's a quite good thing to make sure that you're always deploying into a safe environment. Go back to our scenarios. There's a thing called policy as code. So if you have seen in my previous view here, there is a whole bunch of definitions. So most of those definitions right now are from Microsoft, so they are pre-created, and there's a good news. If you want to handle them as code, they are available on GitHub. So all the policies in the Azure Policy Store are available on GitHub in the right format that you need it. So yay, we can grab it. But if we start creating our own policies, and especially also our assignments, then it's getting interesting because, yeah, we can handle this here in the portal by clicking and moving and doing things. And as long as a policy is that short, it's also easy to handle the if and then thing in the web portal here. If you're growing a little bit, so let me talk about a client that is running actually 1,000 subscriptions. And for those 1,000 subscriptions, they have a whole bunch of policies. I think it's around about 10 to 15 policies per subscription. And then due to the staging, dev test, prod, whatever, they also have different policy configurations per stage. So it's a huge amount of custom policies and custom configurations in the assignment based on such an environment. And then it's not that funny anymore to handle this in the Azure portal, to be honest. So you would start thinking about, hey, this is code already, or this is already written in the JSON format. This is code. So why can't I just take it and use it as code? And yes, there are ways to do this. So let's have a look. If we want to have a look in here, so let me get rid of this. If we want to have a look into a policy, there's an easy way that you could do. You should make sure that the AZ policy command is available. And then you could go ahead and say, I want to get my policy definition. The interesting thing is you always need this policy definition identifier, so the unique ID of it, and then you can grab it. If we have a look into this policy, then you see, okay, that's not really speaking about what we are doing in there. If you want to learn a little bit about a policy, you always have to look into the policy properties, because in there you will find the display name, you will find the description, and you will find also the information about which parameters are needed. And, oh, interesting, there's a policy rule and a policy type feature in there. So in my policy rule, I can see the if-then blocks. So that's quite interesting. Let's pull this out and let's have a look into the policy rule. I see there's my if, and then there is my then. So my object or my action will be the deny action, for example. There's also a whole bunch of metadata connected to this, like a version, like general, like whatever. And if you want to go a bit deeper and say, hey, okay, the then I've seen, but I've not seen the if, also easy. Just go one step deeper and you will see if it's not in my list and so on. So as we've seen it in the portal. So that's a thing, how you can dig into a policy. So it's easy to grab it and to get it out. And now there's a certain way on how to manage policies. And even when you have a look into the GitHub store for Microsoft policies, you will always find this way here. There's a JSON for the policy itself. There is a parameters JSON, and then there is a rules JSON. Why is that? Because if we have a look into policy deployment in a second, you will see that the policy deployment commandlet asks you for a parameters and the rules files separated. So this overall JSON, as we see it in the Azure Portal, with the display name, the description, and then the if-then block in there, and the parameters also, is not working to be pushed from the outside. It is possible, to be honest. You could, because it's JSON, you could just take the whole file and break it into parts via PowerShell by handling the JSON file, get me out the policy rules, separate it, push it into the commandlet. Yes, would be possible. Easier it is if you just handle it with the parameters in the rules file. This is also how Microsoft's doing it. And then you can see your if and then pieces in here. So actually, that's just a rule, that's just the parameters, and the rest is just a nice surrounding of our policy itself. So yeah, and that's the thing. Looking back into Azure DevOps, the option that we have is to store all of this in our GitHub repository, which has the nice feature. If anyone is changing your policy, ever when, and this is breaking something because your next deployment is not running and is running into a policy validation issue, for example, you always have the history of all the things that have been happened to the policy. So if I change West Europe to North Europe, I can see it. If you change West Europe to North Europe back, I can see it. So from a management perspective, having it in code is much more convenient than having it in the Azure Portal. Because if you change it here, you can see there's no go back a version or revert to previous or whatever. So in the Azure Portal itself, what is in the portal is in the portal. That's the state. Bam. There's no rollback. There's no get my last version back or whatever. In a GitHub repository, you always have this chance. I always can say, oh, let me step back to this one here because with this, my deployment actually failed. So that's a good thing about storing those policies in a Git repository. And hey, Azure DevOps has unlimited repos included, so why not using it? Yeah, and then for sure, we could also use policy deployment with Azure DevOps. So it would be possible to use Azure DevOps to just deploy a policy. And if we have a look here, we can also do this by PowerShell. And as DevOps is possible or is able to deploy PowerShell scripts or run PowerShell scripts, at least this would be working. There are also some third-party extensions for policy management that you could use, but natively this would work. So I just take my policy, say, hey, it's the deny West Europe PIP now for my subscription with my parameters file and my policy file with the rules JSON in here. And then just let's kick this off here, run selection. And here we go. So policy created. Now I could assign this one, deny West Europe PIP, run selection. And here we go. And as you can see, there will be some breaking changes in the next version of the Azure PowerShell. So going back to our policy view, we can now see this assignment, deny West Europe. So now neither West nor North Europe PIPs would be allowed in this resource group, which is actually fine for our current situation. Okay, so far so good. So we can use Azure Policy for quite a bunch of tasks. So we can have a look into template validation. We can have pre and post deployment tasks. We can have the whole policy config as code in our repository and even deploy it with GitHub, now I did the hint already, with Azure DevOps. And then there was a point in time where Microsoft kicked in and said like, hey, there's not just DevOps in this world, there's GitHub. So, hey, let's use GitHub instead. So maybe let's roll all the things back and change the title of the situation, Azure Policy and GitHub better together. We don't do this, no worries, I have to stay in time. So looking into GitHub, there's a pretty nice implementation currently. If you have a look into your definitions in the Azure Policy view, there's a tiny little button up here called Export Definitions. And when we click on Export Definitions, you see the only option right now is to export to GitHub. So I have to sign in into my GitHub repo. Here we go. And in my GitHub repo, I have created a repository for Azure Policy. We will directly push into the main branch. And now I can have a look into my policies. And now I can add policy definitions and initiatives to be deployed. So when we have a look into our PIP thing, for example, you see the PIP restrictions. I could take it. And if I would change my scope a little bit, and I just take everything that we have up on here, add policy definitions. We have to look for public. There is it. Restrict public IP, my custom policy that I've created. I will take this one too. And now I also have the thing to have a look in here. Is there any assignment of this? So right now, no assignments found in there. But I can see that this one that I've used earlier is actually already in GitHub. So it was already deployed via GitHub. So that's that far integrated that you can see this right here. I can export my definition and also my assignments if there are some. Easy thing. I click now on Next, Export, done. So the whole thing that I've shown you, like, hey, create this structure, create the parameters JSON, create the rules JSON, and then take your PowerShell script to do the deployment and blah, 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 blah. Forget it if you're using GitHub. Because for GitHub, we have this easy export thing. We see 2 definitions were successfully exported. And now I jump over into my GitHub repo for Azure Policy, and you can see that 10 seconds ago, there was a change. And actually, Microsoft created the policies for me. So we see PIP restrictions and restrict public IP has been created or updated quite recently. And we see in there is the policy JSON, and there's also an assign if there is an assignment. So that's from an earlier run. That's from now. So and herein is my policy JSON. And if you see right now with the export, they only share the store the JSON in GitHub because they also create in my environment the workflows, and in here I have the YAML pipelines to deploy those policies. And in here they take all the steps that are needed to do actually this thing, and it's here create or update Azure Policy with my path in there. So please take all those things. And there's a manage Azure Policy module, which is just used out of GitHub. So I could easily go ahead and say, hey, I want to run my workflows and just push this thing back into my current area. So that's the thing. Actually, quite interesting move. So always think about Azure DevOps, still possible, still working. But now we see that Microsoft's going a heavy way on integrating into GitHub. So maybe also shift your mind towards a possible GitHub implementation. But no matter how, both ways are possible, both ways are fine. And with that, I'm at the end of my session. A big thanks to the sponsors, to the organizers, to everyone who's making this possible, that a guy like me from Germany can present in another country in these times of COVID. So very happy. And if you're able to speak German, I can tell you there's even a LinkedIn course on this whole topic about Azure policies and DevOps. Unfortunately, just in German, but hey, give it a try if you want so. So thanks again. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them now.
Thank you very much, Eric, for your presentation. I haven't seen any questions in the chat, but I actually have a few for you. I was wondering if you had a chance to work with bigger environments that are using something like enterprise scale landing zones, multiple management groups, subscriptions. How would you scope policies in those kind of situations?
Yeah, that's a good point. In the end, it really depends on the overall structure. So when we go from the hierarchy level, it really depends on, hey, do I build my hierarchy on departments, on stages, on I don't know what? And then normally you start a scoping, for example, on a management group, because there you have the first similarities, because you might have, I don't know, for my dev stage, I would have the same set of rules on the basis. And then maybe I go one step lower for some certain rules for a certain project. And that's also the way how you would scope it. So try to find the least minimum of similarities and put it at the highest level, because otherwise you will move into micromanagement. And even in code, you would have to change hundreds of files in the case that you want to change a policy by default.
Yeah, great. And one more thing to clarify, if we have a policy assigned on a subscription level that's denying specific thing, and we have a complete opposite on a resource group level that's allowing that same thing, what would happen with the resource?
Oh, that's a good one. To be honest, I would have to have a look into the documentation. What is taking the first shot? I think the more specified, it's getting higher, but I'm not 100% sure on this.
Okay,
would have to check this. Sorry.
No, totally fine. Thank you. And tell me, did you have maybe a chance to use blueprints for combining policies, ARM templates?
Yeah.
Is there any benefit than what we saw right just now?
Yeah, yes and no. So the things about blueprints is actually it's quite a nice thing, because it's a nice mix of I want to have the click cloud thing, but I also want to have this modern thing of having an ARM template that is always deployed when I create something. So blueprints are quite a nice idea, and blueprints are one option. What I also see is if clients with a large scale are using blueprints, they are aiming to do blueprints as code, because also the management of blueprints in a visual way in the portal is getting annoying if you have 1,000 subscriptions, for example. And there's one tiny little piece that is super annoying for many customers is if you have a blueprint and you do it kind of the way like, hey, this is for all my production stage. And now it comes to a point where you have to change something that sometimes breaks deployments, because they reapply the blueprint and it's kind of resetting the key vault, for example. It's resetting, I don't know, everything. And this is why I also see quite a bunch of clients now getting away from blueprints and more into DevOps, having my stuff in code. And so I can say, hey, for this specific item, like a key vault, I need a dedicated resource that is just configured for this area. So yeah, blueprints are possible. If it's really just for policies, I would better aim for putting them on a management group so that they are auto-applied, because then you don't have the hassle around blueprints. If you really have a standard that sticks through for everything, yeah, blueprints are a good way.
Okay, thank you once again. That would be all, I believe. It was a great presentation, a lot of new things that people could hear and learn, I believe. I hope you had a good time.
Yeah, absolutely. I enjoyed it, and I hope next year we can make this thing in person.
Yes, me too. Okay, once again, thank you very much for having a time for us and attending the conference, speaker.
Thanks, everyone. And yeah, have a great rest of the conference, and hopefully connect online in Twitter, LinkedIn, or whatever. Thanks, everyone.
Sure. Thank you. Bye.